Hi folks, as we enter our last chapter, chapter 22, I want to talk about this chapter and these different styles that are addressed in this chapter, just kind of a summary. So, I want to talk about how we can determine whether we're looking at Romanticism, Realism, Neoclassical, some of these things, an approach I take. Would it happen? Could it happen? And then we're going to talk a little bit about realistic versus realism, and then the institution and the changes that are happening as we move into modernism. So first thing I want to do is rewind just a moment. So back to the previous chapter when we were talking about Rococo, we talked about natural art, and we talked about neoclassical art. So one of the sets of questions I like to ask to frame sort of everything from Rococo to into the modern area is the two questions: could it happen and would it happen? So when we are looking at a Rococo painting like this, it could happen, more or less. I mean, you could get a lady dressed like that on a swing, but it'd be pretty unlikely for you to capture that particular composition, that particular arrangement. So it could happen, I guess, but it probably wouldn't happen. Now, the natural art that we looked at in chapter 21 would happen and could happen. You could imagine capturing exactly that scene right there. And we can apply this to neoclassical art as well. So this particular painting, would it happen? Well, actually, let me ask that in the other way. Could it happen? Sure. This is a realistic looking person. She's sitting in a natural-ish way. She's got a few extra backbones in there. Her back is extra long. So there's some distortion here, but the general pose, it could happen. Would you be likely to come across this? Certainly not. This is a fantasy version of what might be actually happening in the real world. So this is Dominique Ingres, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who is painting a fantasy. This is one that I talk about when we talk about feminist art, because this one is definitely about being able to look at a beautiful woman, at a sexually available beautiful woman. This is absolutely made for the pleasure of a male audience, either the painter or the patron or the viewers or whatever it is. There's a lot of things in here that are realistic, but the idea of actually happening upon this is not realistic. And this distinction between realism and realistic or naturalism is again one I think that's helpful to use these two questions. Would it happen and could it happen? So this, the last one we talked about is realistic in some ways. As we move into chapter 22, where we talk a little bit about neoclassicism, but we mostly focus on romanticism, realism, and some modernism in general, I want to start to distinguish between something that is realistic and something that is realistic in how its proportions are and stuff like that, versus realistic in it actually is showing us real life. Another set of terms I want to talk about here is the idea of artifice, and we sometimes in the book it's referred to as a formal composition. So when we look at a lot of neoclassical art, it is realistic as far as proportions, as far as shading, as far as the illusion of depth. All of these things are fairly realistic, but they are not necessarily things that actually would happen. It could happen. You could get this composition. Probably that's not really what Napoleon looks like when he's riding on horseback. He looks pretty majestic here. We get a sense of his power because of the artifice applied by the artist. So the artist has made some changes here to make us aware of Napoleon's heroism, right? Kind of like the grand manner paintings that we looked at in the previous chapter. But it's not, it wouldn't be what you would actually see if you were walking there with Napoleon. It's a fantasy version. The composition is fairly formal in that he's arranged the composition symmetrically. We've got this framing of the landscape behind with a few people, this bright red contrast of Napoleon's clothing, which, as you may notice, are perfectly clean, even though he's out here fighting battles and stuff like that. So that is a little bit of artifice. It's fake, right? It's altered for the story here. So this is neoclassical, and you can recognize some of the formality here and the sort of heroic scene. As we move into Romanticism, there's a lot of overlap, right? This is, the one we just talked about. It's a very powerful, emotional, romantic kind of story, right? As we move into true Romanticism, we get this, we still have very clean lines. We have colors that are contained within their spaces. So like this red is all red. We don't have a reflection of the red onto the white cloth here. This brown is all brown. We don't have any staining or irregular kinds of mixing of colors that we might see in some of the real world, which we'll talk about once we get into Romanticism or realism. So this is a very dramatic story. We see a lot of emotion. The lighting and the composition are artificially adjusted to give us this sense of drama. Back to could we see it? Would we see it? Could we see something like this? Could this happen? Sure. You could imagine if you wanted to turn this into a photograph, you could adjust the lighting and the composition and make a backdrop that has, set yourself up inside of cave and set up a cross in the background. You could see this. Would you see it? Are you likely to come across this? Is this really what the burial looked like? Probably not. This is a romanticized version of what's really going on. I also want to stress as we talk about Romanticism that I'm not talking about love, right? This is not a romantic love. Here's another romantic painting, but again, it's not about hearts and flowers and valentines and stuff like this. This is a dramatic composition. It is emotional. We see a very strong emphasis. How do we see emphasis here? Contrast of color, open space around the man, lots of lines, directional lines pointing us towards the man who is in the focus. He is in a different position than everyone around him, and of course we have this open space and bloody red contrasting color kind of in front of him, giving him a little bit of a frame. Now, could this happen? It's based on a real life event. Would it happen this way? No, there's some artifice in how it's put together. This composition is formalized as to how it's arranged, how it's composed. The visual structure is not what you would happen across in real life. Now, not all romantic subjects are something we actually could see, right? Here we have mythological story, Saturn devouring one of his children. I mean, could it happen in we could have mythical stories based on reality? Sure, I don't know. But basically this is dramatic. This is formally composed. We are supposed to get a sense of an emotion or a reaction here when we look at this. Another story based on real life. Did this actually happen? Well, I mean, the event happened. Did the actual composition that we see here happen? No, of course not. This is not what you do if you're on a raft and you're stranded at sea. You do not line everybody up in a triangular composition. It is not realistic in that way. It is not a composition that is realistic. It is that realistic proportions, realistic lighting, or potentially realistic lighting. It could happen. It probably wouldn't look this way. It's a mixture of some realistic elements and some artificially composed formal elements of the arrangement here. And why are they artificially arranged? To heighten the emotion and the drama. Again, heighten the emotion and the drama. Did this or could this happen in the story? Oh yeah, it is sort of. Would it happen exactly this way? Probably not. It's overly dramatic. It's overly wrought emotionally. Again here. This one I always say, if you're gonna go out fighting, you might put your shirt all the way on, right? This is a romanticized version of what happened. Liberty here is a personification. She's not really a woman leading the battle. Again, if you're gonna lead the battle, put some shoes on, put your shirt all the way on. But this is a romanticized version of what this fight was about, and even some of the other characters are adjusted. They're not dressed as for battle. The composition here is highly dramatic, artificial, but depicting a realistic sort of depth and a realistic proportions and an event that is based on something that really happened. Now, another kind of thing we see in Romanticism is this dramatic, sublime nature depicted. So here we have Wanderer above a sea of mist. This could happen. Would it look exactly like this? Well, I guess if you're really good at photography and you've set this up exactly this way, but this isn't what we just happen upon in general life, right? Here we have the power of the sea. We have the power of the sea. It could happen. We could have this slave ship and we could see the bodies in the water, but the artist is trying to get us to have an emotional reaction to what was a real event, but the composition here is adjusted to see the power of the sea and the horror of this slave ship. Here we have something that's not so much a real event, but the composition here is arranged to show us the power of nature, the storm coming through, the sublime, the grandeur of what the view here. Again, the grandeur of the view. This could happen, right? But that composition's pretty impressive. I mean, you could capture this, but again, it's not the everyday scene. Things have been adjusted in the composition to give us this sublime power of nature. All right. So that's Romanticism, sort of the both trends of it. As we move into realism, we're also moving into modernism. And one of the things we're gonna need to talk about is the distinction between realistic and realism. We've been talking about a lot of realistic art this quarter. All quarter we've talked about realistic proportions based on Greek ideas of looking at the human body. We've had several art styles where we've had alterations to those realistic proportions or a realistic sense of depth. Mannerism, for example, the Baroque, we get distortions and things like that. But often we've been focusing on realistic depth, realistic lighting, realistic texture, all of that. In realism, the style, which is a whole different thing from realistic stuff, realism, what we need to focus on is not just is the space depicted realistically, but what are the subjects and intent. Because the the art of realism, the focus was on a different sort of subject. So the artists of this time period were interested in depicting real working people. So this is not a dramatically composed composition, right? This is not altered and artificial. It's just what you would actually see. If you were walking past some people whose job it was to break up stone, this might be what it looked like. They're not heroic. They're just doing their job, which you might find to be heroic, but it's not artificially arranged to be heroic. This is a burial. It's what it really looks like. Is this composition arranged to show the drama and emotion of this burial? No. This is a a snapshot of what it really would look like if you were out here burying the person, right? And nobody is wailing, falling on the ground. People are crying. There's emotion here, but it's a much more natural view of emotion than what we see in the romantic time period. These women are picking up the leavings of the harvest, gleaning what's left from the harvest. They are not dramatically posed. They are in the foreground. We see realistic depth, shading, texture, some of that. One of the other things you notice in the realism style is we don't have quite as clean marks on the page, and I'm going to try to pop back to something like this, where the neoclassical paintings where the surfaces are perfectly smooth, you get very crisp distinctions between edges, the tone, there's no mixing of color, and then if we pop back here, we get reflections, all other kinds of colors mixing together. What color is her shirt? Well, it's kind of a dingy, what is that, blue, but also we see some green here, we see a little bit of red. The colors are mixing in a way that foreshadows what we're going to see in the next chapter, next quarter, right? When we move into the Impressionism and other modernist movements. We start to see artists being more focused on actually observing the colors they see in the world rather than making all of the surfaces perfect. And so the surfaces get a little bit rougher, a little bit less clear, less specific in some of their details. I'm going to stop this one right here and do another one to finish up talking about a couple things.